Hello there. Welcome back to the Non-Serviam podcast. I'm Lucy Steigerwald, as always, and today in the internet studio is William Gillis, a name that is certainly familiar to a decent number of listeners, but if it's not, it will be if you keep listening. William, who I totally met one time a couple years ago, though I don't remember how many more. Welcome.
Welcome. It's good to be here, Lucy.
William Gillis is a second-generation anarchist who's worked as an activist in countless projects and capacities since getting involved in the lead up to N30, which is the famous battle in Seattle in 1999. And we're also wanting to talk a little bit about what he's been doing at the Fully Informed Jury Association and his new book. But as we like to do, I want to start with, if I demanded, say, what are your politics right now? What would you say?
I mean, I think of myself as the most plumb line anarchist there could possibly be. I just hit every single thing perfectly. So there's no deviation. But I would say that in many ways, I'm a plumb line anarchist. But in the context of the current anarchist movement and the current political perspective, I would say that most people would classify me as a left market anarchist, which is to say that I support or I see great value in markets as a tool for organizing and for collaboration and for making sure that we can solve basic economic problems. And I also am strongly aligned with values that have traditionally been associated with the left around egalitarianism, the struggles of the oppressed, etc. I don't really identify with the term left or the leftism or anything like that, because I don't think that term has any concrete definition whatsoever. But people classify the sort of like orientation towards markets that I have as a left orientation. And more broadly, I have some infamy in traditional anarchist circles for defending technology, as opposed to the anarcho-primitivist or some more green anti-civ currents. So that's another particular deviation that I
have. When I saw you speak, I think you gave the best defense of primitivism and then kind of destroyed it, if I recall correctly. And it was good. I love to see something that I admittedly already disagree with defended well and then smashed to smithereens, because one of these days I'm going to have to get an actual primitivist on here to defend primitivism, because I'm unreasonably mad at it probably most of the time.
I could point you to there are some decent individuals out there who have held the line against certain fascist entryism, like, if you're interested.
Yeah, maybe so. That could be good. Have you changed? Did you have a journey to get where you are? I mean, second generation anarchist kind of says something there, but
yeah, I kind of feel it's become almost this distracting mandatory introductory section in podcasts, that episodes that I go on that become like 10-15 minute divergences. So I'll try to keep it short, but basically, like, my dad was an anarchist, so at age 5, I got introduced to what anarchism was, and in some sense, like, the values and that kind of stuff was there long before, and I always like clicked with it. So there has never been a moment in my life where I have not identified as an anarchist, or at least insofar as I had any political awareness or perspective whatsoever. But the flavor of anarchist has definitely changed over the years.
Okay.
And when I was younger, I would say probably while my family was homeless while I was a child for a chunk period, and I went through a lot of really, like, we were very desperate on the streets, and a lot of things. And I had a very, the terminology wasn't really there, because there wasn't really such a thing as like nihilist anarchist back then. And I still don't think that really is coherent or meaningful or denotes anything really. But people who today call themselves nihilist, I would say that was pretty close to my like perspective back then, which was to say that, like, I was in a lot of rough scenarios and didn't really see like either hope or like concrete pathways on anything. I was very just like kind of cynical in a ton of regards. Resist. Yeah, do a little things to, like, impede power, but I didn't have any perspective of hope. I just like, well, civilization will crash too. Like the state will eventually come down. Some people will survive. Maybe, it is what it is. Power is not sustainable in the long run. And it really took going to Seattle, getting involved in the lead up organizing, and then going to the Battle of Seattle and being attacked by the police and everything else along those ways, and seeing kind of like being charged by the very noble kind of resistance of other protesters in the streets against the police state, and against the kind of draconian, more broadly policies that kind of gave me a little bit of like, oh, hey, maybe there's like the slightest, 1/1000th of a % chance that we can see a better world. And if your entire world is dark and miserable and awful, the slightest glimmer of hope is like, well, the odds are long. We're all going to die anyway. Fascism is going to win and inevitably, but maybe not. And that became enough for me to kind of dramatically change my entire orientation towards a lot of things. And ever since then, I've been, I would say that I've pretty much been the same strand, but at that point I would have identified mostly as like an anarcho-primitivist, very influenced by John Zorzen. And then as I grew up and matured, or churned on the politic quite a bit, there were always little things that I had disagreements with, and then eventually I got to where I'm at right now, which had two pretty big like pivots, right, on both technology and on markets.
Yeah, which are I mean, I know you get some shit for that. Do you get as much as I'm imagining? I mean,
it's changed over the years.
I sometimes I think of you as sort of a bridge from like between something like Center for Stateless Society and, well, anarchists like my California cousin, which to me sums up all the sort of social anarchists. And you are the bridge between them. And I don't know if people are walking in the middle, though. So, like, I don't know.
Well, I'd say there's when I talk to a lot of social anarchists, people you would call social anarchists, and the term social anarchist has associations with book gins, so people will like be quite hostile to that phrase. But
I never know which. Yeah.
I would just say mainline anarchist.
Mainline,
right?
Okay.
Like, okay. Yeah. I mean, because it's vast and diverse, but it's not the more like libertarian infused thing. People ask me about C4SS, and I say, well, C4SS has people who come basically from two directions. One, you get like mainline anarchists who get convinced of the market analysis, or get convinced of like, oh shit, actually we can't have communism work at scale. We can't like accomplish all these variety of things. The only practical or pragmatic solution is to just permit people to trade. And here are some ways that we can do that without having compounding runaway like tyranny. And then the other direction you get, I think, what is probably more classic to a lot of people's perspective, which is like a libertarian, maybe even an ANCAP, somebody from the right, who reads C4SS literature and is like, wait, I don't have to hate gay people. Wait, I don't have to hate workers, right? And then like shifts over in perspective. Or, that's a joke. Obviously, people typically didn't come in with that hatred, but started to realize, I think, the wider umbrella of considerations around liberty, commitment to, as SFL used to have as their slogan, don't tread on anyone, right?
I have like 3 shirts that say that. I met at least 2 or 3, maybe, like C4SS people, a lot of them I met at Students for Liberty gatherings, which was so big tent for a minute that it had C4SS tables and it had actual conservative tables. So that was kind of a weird moment. But
and at one point it had literal Nazi table, as in Richard Spencer showing up to the SFO.
I saw that.
For listeners, he was kicked out.
Yes, it was unofficial, but
he was brought in by students who were involved. So
yes,
a sign for how things would go.
Indeed.
Yeah, 2017, rough year. Not as rough as this one, but
Correct. Dear. I guess we kind of hit if you changed your mind on anything, but have you changed your mind on anything more recently since those big shifts, even something smaller in the last, I don't know, like 1 to 5 years?
Yeah, there have been some things that I was wrong on. I'm not keeping them easily categorized in my brain, so I'm not able to remember. One that that for a few years was my last big one that I was wrong on, but I've been wrong on stuff since. So this is more self-serving because it's been a longer time. This one was, I thought the porn industry would go belly up because of piracy.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
and had terribly wrong prediction. I thought it would go belly up within like a couple of years. It would be impossible for, I was like, well, there'll be this long tail of like custom made content or whatever along those lines. But like the vast majority of the porn industry will clearly go belly up. And it has obviously faced massive economic travails and things. But at least in terms of a prediction, it moved to a streaming thing. Intellectual property didn't like erode as far as I had hoped and thought it would. A variety of other things didn't change. This isn't to say that sex workers producing content are in better shoes than necessarily in some systems they were back then. I'm not, it's just a mess. But I had a pretty clear prediction. It was pretty naive. And that was, I don't know, 15 years ago or something. I don't know when I made that prediction, but I flubbed that one. I'm trying to think of more recently. You flub up on little things all the time. COVID. That's a big one. I really thought the right was going to be, for years and years and years, for decades. For like almost 2 decades. Before COVID, I was really deeply concerned that if a pandemic happened, anarchism might never recover because the population would be so emphatically pro state action and a desperate need for defense and security, and sometimes legitimately, like there are conceivable levels of outbreak where there needs to be some level of, I would say, non-state coercion, but some level of like distancing that has to be coerced, right? Like, get the fuck out of this neighborhood. We're like closing things off for a while and whatever. There are things. And so like maybe more with the zombie outbreak kind of like perspective in mind, and also how conservatives had like fetishized like how the moment that somebody's infected, we get to kill them kind of stuff around
Right. Sure.
zombie media. I was convinced that when we had a big outbreak, when that inevitably happened, conservatives would be leading the charge on total lockdown and total control.
Wow.
And so a lot of my writing, especially at the beginning of COVID, was like, or in preparation even before, was about like how we can solve these problems ourselves, how we do not need the state to do it, right? How social pressure can achieve the ends that we want, right? How decentralized, bottom-up, autonomous, etiquette and mutual aid can resolve these problems and coordinate and resolve the collective action problem, how we don't need the state, how we can do it for ourselves. And then conservatives were like, if you ask me to mask at the Baskin Robbins, it's a genocide. And I was not expecting that response. I just was not expecting that response. And then, the left was the one that when there were overreaches in the direction of government control, the left was the one backing it. And I was also not expecting that response. I also was very concerned that COVID would be used to reinforce borders and nationalism. And the right just kind of dropped the ball on it. They just didn't pull it. I mean, there was a little bit of like, oh no, it's China did it. It's the evil, gross Chinese people eating animals or whatever that all that kind of like, xenophobia or whatever that, although, it's interesting also, I mean, we could go on a whole side tangent about how like the claims around whether it was lab made or whether it was from a meat market. It's fascinating also that the evidence seems to just point towards it was actually just at the meat market, and the lab was there because the diseases had risen at the meat market.
That's kind of what I thought at this point. But sane people have dabbled in.
Yeah, but I think there was some rational doubt at some points on that story. But it's fascinating that it was invented in a lab became like the conservative like baseline position. Or like the standard bearer, like the thing that they were obsessed about. When the more racist position would be, it's because these people were, these horrible, Chinese, alien, non-ethnic, whatever, like, or not us, people are eating animals that we wouldn't be eating because they're gross. And it seems to me that like that's more the like intuitively racist like kind of narrative that you would expect. So it's a bunch of things shook out in ways around COVID that I just was not expecting around how political discourse ended up congealing. And I think a ton of that was so random and contingent. I think if we'd played it forward a little bit differently, I think if like the death rate had been higher or like other things, or like even just like a piece of media came out at a certain period of time, like I think the political valences could have shifted in a very different direction. But I really did not. I wrote whole pieces being like, the one thing I'm so desperately concerned about with regards to like the legitimization of anarchism is outbreaks and diseases, and people will think that the CDC is the critical justification for the entirety of the state apparatus, and it did not play out that way. So
no, much weirder than that. Yeah, I'm distracted now thinking about how the echo of the wet market thing, we just saw that instead show up in Ohio with the Haitians.
Yeah.
And but conservatives they didn't need COVID to be xenophobic freaks. They just did it all by themselves. They don't need the help. Particular influences, like classic anarchists / people you knew, to help you get where you are, besides being anarchist junior?
I mean, I don't, a lot of the people who are the biggest causal influence on me are also people that I don't like align with the most, right?
Okay.
So John Zerzan, huge influence, like incredible influence on me. And I would also say like the writers at Ajota, Anarchy, a Journal of Desire Armed. So Lawrence, even even Bob Black, even people like Wolfie Lenstrider, huge. I mean, those were like, that was my home team for the longest time within anarchism when I was much younger. And it took me a while to kind of like, I was still like, well, they're wrong on these things, but they're, et cetera. And increasingly now I just almost have, I mean, those people think I'm the devil, but I will spontaneously spend a while defending them from unfair critiques in social settings or whatever, where somebody just and I'm like, well, that's unfair. They're not actually saying this. They said this. But there's a variety of things that as time went on, I was like, oh, wow, I didn't realize that, Wolfie had said this. I didn't realize that this person had said that. I didn't realize the context of this for things that, and just more generally, my politics have diverged, but I'd say they were hugely influential in terms of people that I align with when I, because there's a different sort of experience where you crack open history books and you find someone and you're like, wow, you're really cool. I really like you, but you already are on the same page. It's not like they like gave you the tools. It's like, you're like, oh, well, we both already agree on this thing. I would say like my classic two are Voltairine de Cleyre and Enrico Malatesta. Voltairine was a market anarchist in Benjamin Tucker's circle in Boston, and contemporary of Emma Goldman. Emma was very catty and hostile to her.
I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, she apparently was. It sounds so misogynistic to say this, but like enough people, including Emma, have like strong evidence that she like apparently hated Voltairine for being prettier than her. Yeah, like so, like
oh dear,
like just silly, like classic, like intra community drama kind of things. But yeah, so so I really appreciate a lot of Voltairine de Cleyre, and Enrico Malatesta he started out as both of them started out as kind of dyed in the wool ideologues of a certain current within anarchism. So Voltairine started out as a market anarchist, and Enrico Malatesta started as an anarcho-communist, and both of them, as they matured, didn't really abandon their like a lot of their perspectives, but like grew more inclusive and more nuanced in their perspective. And I tend to think that both of them just hit it right on the money on almost everything. There's little moments like Voltairine said like a racist thing one time, and I think around. Well, she probably around indigenous stuff. I'm trying to remember exactly. Mexican Revolution, maybe. And Enrico had this is more tenuous, but his best friend Fabry Continote medically raped another comrade, and that comrade ended up turning into a major prominent fascist as a. I mean, I'm not going to say fully consequent. She has her own agency in that thing, but you can. The history there is actually really dark and terrible.
Yeah.
And it's actually far worse than I'm describing. But yeah. So, but not entirely perfect people, either of them, but right on the money on a lot of subjects, and way consistent and advanced for their time in a ton of ways. And I just find a lot of camaraderie when I read their work or look back on them in history.
I would like to start talking about jury nullification a bit. Can you explain kind of what jury nullification is?
It's when jurors vote not guilty in a trial or in another context. That could be where it's grand jury or where it's civil trial or not necessarily criminal trial, where they vote not guilty for reasons other than the bare facts. So it could be a matter of they disapprove of the law, or they judge the law in a different way than the judge judges the law, so that they think that the law cuts in one direction versus the entirety of the existing legal establishment thinks it cuts in a different direction, or has different contours or boundaries. Or it can be, so it can be that they think the law should be applied or defined differently. It can be that they think that the law is invalid. As an anarchist, I think all laws are invalid. Two, it can also just be a matter of conscience. It can be a matter of, I can never in good conscience convict someone of whatever the thing is, even if I think the law is good, if there is an additional context to that. So for example, a lot of cases that I find very high degree of salience are around survivor defendants. So individuals who have gone through immense abuse, have maybe been pimped out by someone, who have been horrifically abused, maybe their partners have attempted to murder them in the past, etc., and they exercise lethal force or force of some kind against that person. And oftentimes, even though it's very clear self-defense and very clear immediate self-defense, they are still convicted and sentenced. It would be nice if juries didn't do that. It would be nice, and I think that if certain people are in a juror box, I would love it if they just voted not guilty, even if a judge pressures them to judge that person is guilty. But I think, or to convict. But I think more generally, there's also cases where especially around survivor defendants, the immediacy of the threat is something that the legal system can't really parse. So if you're living in a house with someone, and that person has promised to murder you, and they go to bed and they wake up, and when is it going to happen? You don't know. The threat is omnipresent. You can't escape it. If you were try to go to your mother's house, they would track you down and shoot you, and you murder them in their sleep. To me, is just a person. That seems to me to be completely valid self-defense, right? What are you going to do otherwise? How are you going to extract yourself from that situation? No, there's not an immediate aggression in the sense of just that person directly pulled a gun on you, and if you were able to get your pistol out faster,
the perfect platonic ideal of self-defense, kind of.
Right. I think is how a lot of ANCAPs wedded to the non-aggression principle oftentimes myopically kind of collapse things down. And I look at that situation and I'm like, well, if you're a slave and you're chained up, the aggression is ongoing,
very much so.
Right? And what it takes to escape from the person who has enslaved you is maybe not something that looks like you both pull guns at high noon, right? It doesn't. It has to. Just the structures of the context of the thing have to look very differently. So that's something that I'm very passionate about. But there's a variety of other instances, and my partner runs letters to prisoners sort of thing. So I've talked with a number of women who were convicted, are serving life sentences for something that, if you look at just the every piece of evidence in the case, it's overwhelmingly obvious that if she didn't shoot him, he had burst into the house with a gun, like all these things. If she had not killed him then, she would be dead. The sheriff that arrives upon the scene says that everything, and according to the exact structures of the law in the state or whatever where that takes place, the judge says you have no choice but to convict if you think that these like specific facts took place. And so, like, it would be great if juries did not convict in those situations. But of course, there's many others, like cannabis, possessing a gun without a license, like all sorts of different things that are classic spoonering, like victimless crimes. So those are other instances that I think are pretty clear. It would be great if they were unenforceable because juries refuse to convict. And then there's other instances like. So right now in the UK, there's this organization, Defend Our Juries. So FIJA, the Fully Informed Jury Association, is based out of the United States and has been doing work on jury nullification and promoting it and building it to the level of public attention that it now has since 1989. So we've been around for a long time, 36 years. But in the UK, this organization only formed in 2020, basically promoting jury nullification there. It was formed by leftists. So FIJA was formed by libertarians and folks involved in the civil rights struggle in the South.
Like American libertarians and all the right-ish coding.
Right, with all of the connotations
yes.
that has, right? Whereas although, anyway, but in Defend Our Juries in the UK, the situations they're facing are a little bit different, and the organization was formed initially by environmentalists. And they were basically holding placards out in front of courthouses saying, jurors have the right not to convict or to vote not guilty for reasons of conscience. And people have been arrested and sentenced and harassed quite dramatically for holding placards like that in front of courthouses in the UK. And I think that's also something that is a pressing issue.
In America, in the past, I know a couple of people have gotten in trouble for passing out pamphlets about jury. I don't know if that was anything Free State Project-y. It's been too long to remember, but
I can start listing names if you want them. So Julian Hecklin was a recent one, and I think he served some time. I'm not entirely certain. But he was sharing FIJA brochures outside of the Southern District
and what
Court
is
in
the
New York.
The alleged crime? Like what is the state's?
So typically it's jury tampering, it's defiance of a judge's order or a court order. Those are typically where they go. You have to like, do a little dance a little bit to make sure that you're not crossing certain boundaries. So in his case, so you're not allowed to talk to a juror who's currently been impaneled in a jury about the case that they are impaneled of. But that's different from just handing them a sheet of paper that says, like, you have the right to do this, right? Like, that's not, it's a different sort of thing. And it's also, but judges will sometimes, and prosecutors and folks will sometimes, like, evaluate this differently if they think that, like, you are targeting a specific case. Like, what's important for FIJA is that we do the work. Like, I'm not out in front of a courthouse every day, but multiple days or various days. If you can do that, you're just helping, in general. You're helping, or you're trying to get to jurors before they're impaneled, and you're not talking about them about the particulars. Now, in the case of Julian, an FBI agent tried to entrap him by trying to get him to talk about a specific case. He refused to, but he was arrested and charged with jury tampering nonetheless. And there's all sorts of things where they do, like, anti-free speech, like you're not allowed to pass out literature in front of a courthouse kind of things, which are just obvious violations of the First Amendment. And so those are the sort of directions that they go on. Now, we have a lot of federal and state, et cetera, case law that defends people handing out FIJA literature. And if somebody gets in trouble, there will be people who will spring to, like, support them in certain regards. But there are certain things that you can't do. Like, you can't, like, like, if you're going to do it on the sidewalk, you can't just, like, walk into the courthouse and make a scene or make a ruckus. They do have the right to ask you to leave there according to the existing legal system, et cetera. And And then also one of the things that I think is really important, because I think at this point most people understand what jury nullification is. Like the bat signal has gone out for enough years that like it's wide enough in circulation that at least it's like broadly discussed. But I think a lot of people don't understand the particulars of like exactly what a legal system looks like in your specific case, in your specific state, in a certain jurisdiction or whatever, or in a certain context. And more generally, I think a lot of people have, especially right libertarians, and bless them, but bless their hearts, but have treated jury nullification as a opportunity to pontificate in jury selection.
Okay.
Which is the worst possible time to do it, right? And to like get up in front of the jury selection and read aloud a speech, and the judge tells you to shut the fuck up and immediately dismisses you. And you know, you get to feel noble and heroic for like the 5 seconds before like before you're asked to leave, or you know, you spend a night in jail because you were violating a judge's order in the selection process. And that's just not effective. That's not saving anyone's life. That's not going to like really change anything. But if you are able to get onto a jury, right, without getting like pulled out, knowing what jury nullification is and the fullness of your rights, then when you are on that jury, you can maybe save someone's life, right, and you can maybe have an impact for good, and that can look sometimes like discussing jury nullification with other jurors in the context of the case, however obliquely, because judges will have the right to lie to you and say that you don't get to do that and give you instructions. That
my understanding is
same as
that's usually what they do. I mean, that's
yeah, they make you swear all kinds of different things, and you can you basically do have to follow the judge's instructions basically to the letter on almost everything, minus your vote. So a judge can throw you in contempt or whatever, just throw you from the jury for violating the judge's instructions on pretty much anything. And the judge can make you swear to obey to like all sorts of different things. But the one thing the judge can't actually enforceably make you do is your final vote. So the judge can make you swear that your final vote will only be on the facts of the trial, but it's well known legally that doesn't mean anything. And also there's no distinction between like judging the facts of a situation and judging the law in that situation. The jury just inherently, according to our jury system, has to be able to do both. Even if like judges and prosecutors would really, really rather that not be the case, it is the case. So
I just have to I assume that I almost got on a jury once, and then I kind of messed up the particulars. But my pessimistic understanding is usually kind of like, oh, they're not trying to get anyone thinking too hard on a jury. So like, or if anyone asks me, you know, on a murder case, if you're like willing to enforce the death penalty or however they would phrase it, and I assume I would say no, and that would be that. You know, it's I know you're not allowed to advocate certain things in your capacity, or you shouldn't, you know, but I still wonder kind of how people who might be more willing to do jury nullification even get on those.
Yeah, it's unclear, and I think you know there's obviously the case that a lot of instinctive jury nullification takes place.
That's a perfect way of putting it that I was actually kind of trying to get towards. Yeah,
I think a lot of people hear the instructions of the judge and don't really think about something, and then when they're faced with the particulars of a case, just like their conscience so revolts against what they're being assigned to do and obliged to do that they just cannot do it and refuse to do it. And I think that we know that that's the case, especially around possession laws, guns or substances or that kind of thing. We know that juries like the acquittance rate is very, very high in a consistent way on certain things, even when the evidence so-called is like overwhelming in terms of like a certain factual evaluation. And we know that there are lots of instances, quite famously in the news right now, around protests in LA and and in DC. Who knows if this will continue to bear out in Chicago and now with their invasion of Portland, if local juries will continue to do this thing. But grand juries, for like the first time basically ever, I mean, like the infamous joke going back several decades now is that a prosecutor can get a grand jury to indict a ham sandwich, right? Like things are so stacked against defendants in the context of grand juries that indictments are basically trivial. The only instance where grand juries almost never turn down indictments is when it involves cops, because prosecutors are not interested in indicting cops, right? So everything is it's the prosecutor's show. They get to control evidence, they get to control narrative, they get to control everything. And then in addition, in almost every place, like grand juries are not it's not consensus. You don't have a veto as an individual in that situation. And the fraction of the grand jury necessary for an indictment is oftentimes like incredibly trivial. Like there's instances where it's like two jurors just need to vote to indict, and then that's it, right? So, and the size of the grand jury pool often it changes dramatically. It's hugely variable in grand juries. So and there's no defense given, right? Like zero defense given. The only defense that somebody who's going to be indicted could conceivably have is from the grand jurors themselves, who are allowed to ask critical and deep probing questions of the prosecutor, but no one does that, right? One of the things that we have in this new pamphlet for FIJA new design we just put out is just a paragraph subsection talking about grand juries and about how, like, okay, so you may not be able to get a hung like trial, you may not be able to, or like not trial, but you may not be able to like hang the jury, you may not be able to like stop an indictment on certain things, but you can lay the groundwork because all of the prosecutor's testimony or like statements to you are locked into the record, and they can be damned by a defense attorney in the future if you can lock them down on a bunch of things. So just cross-examine the shit out of the prosecutor, ask them all kinds of probing and like incredibly difficult and aggressive questions, like really make them sweat. And there's no limit to the amount of questions you can ask a prosecutor. When you're impaneled on a grand jury. So if you want to help the defense, just like go in, be the defense, right, of the individual that they're trying to indict. And what we're seeing in LA and in DC is actually incredibly inspiring, which is the grand juries just categorically refusing to indict protesters, right? And you know, there's certainly something to be said for the fact that like the current Justice Department is, you know, a shit show that doesn't know what it's doing, that is all politically like inclined prosecutions, that like is a bunch of yahoos who don't know what they're doing, which in some ways is better than having, you know, a Justice Department that knows what it's doing, but is targeting anyone they perceive as dissidents or like anyone who could be like a danger to the regime, right? And so there's something to be said for the fact that like grand juries may simply not be doing grand jury nullification. They may simply just be looking at the dog shit evidence and being like, well, this just doesn't hold up. This person, there's obviously not a case here. Or that like somebody threw a ham sandwich or the Subway sandwich, as famously happened in DC. Some white dude in like, I think like a pink polo and khaki shorts or something, just like got so fed up with a immigration agent that he was yelling at that he threw a sandwich at
the hero American
and they're trying to and so you know, they sent a whole SWAT team to attack his house. I mean, he volunteered to turn himself in when they said that they were pressing charges. He's like, oh, of course. And they're like, no, we need the public show of dragging you out of your house and beating down the door and pointing guns in your face and show the world that no one will be allowed to throw food at us. And it's just so, you know, it's so fascist and obscene. But you know, the fact that grand juries will say that is not a felony, that throwing a piece of food at an officer is not actually a felony, there is an argument to be made that that's just not even grand jury nullification. That's just like reading the law in a specific way that the prosecutor doesn't like. Which, fair. But it also seems to be the case that with the overwhelming pile of like grand jury resistance that's happening right now, and I'm used to saying grand jury resistance in a different context around like people refusing to testify before grand juries, but the resistance of the grand jurors themselves, overwhelming in DC and LA, and hopefully spreads to other places where they just look at things and they're like, okay, well, I think that there are probably situations where the letter of the law does convict you for basic free speech things, and it doesn't matter. Grand juries are so offended by that they're just refusing to prosecute. And I'm not a big defender of the liberal checks and balances system. I think the whole point of anarchism is to have, a great many multitude more
Mm-hmm.
checks and balances and a more robust ecosystem of civil society. But it is something to be said that like probably the last like wing of government in checks and balances right now
Mm-hmm.
is the jury box, right? So if folks want to continue to be like good liberals working within the system in some sense, like the one thing that you need to be doing is like really endorsing, jury resistance against incredible authoritarian prosecutions.
I don't want to make you argue with an imaginary like normie liberal, but I do kind of want to ask you: is there a downside to jury nullification? Because I don't know if you would call like is there a negative like a bad jury nullification? Is finding the murderers of Emmett Till not guilty, even though they obviously were because of horrifying Jim Crow stuff? Is that jury nullification in some way? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's all jury unification, and the example that I would take more readily, I think refusal to convict lynchers
Mm-hmm.
is of course important, as not important in a good sense, but important to like bring up and consider. But there's also just like juries refusing to convict
Right.
cops
Sure. Of
for
course.
instances where the cops are clearly abusing power in a very strong way. So jury nullification is, I think, a net positive in a very
Mm-hmm.
strong sense. But with anything, it depends upon the jurisdiction and the context. And uh, it's not really like nullification in a specific sense, but there are also instances where juries will violate the letter of the law or the facts of the case and convict someone because they
Mm-hmm.
don't like that person. Right. We know this
Mm-hmm.
about racist juries. We know this about like specific instances where somebody's clearly innocent, just clearly innocent. And because of whatever racial animus or whatever, somebody will convict them anyway. And we also know of, and again, so you have instances where folks refuse to convict. And I think there are also instances where the jury has refused to convict individuals who are, uh, you know, clearly, uh, clearly guilty, and where the acquittal or the innocence that comes down leads to greater levels of
Mm-hmm.
horror, right, and authoritarian power. If you refuse to convict um, a a cop who murdered someone, I think that probably decreases the net liberty there is in the world, and that's a complicated like
Mm-hmm.
evaluation to make. As you know, I think I'm very consequentialist in some ways, so like those evaluations, it's always contingent and strategic and complex, and we can't just be like uniform. It's never a good thing when any state conviction comes down in any degree whatsoever, right? Like if Nixon had been prosecuted for what he had done, I think that and had been convicted, I think that probably would have been a net reduction of state power, right? Um, didn't end up happening, right? But like you could see situations where somebody commits a heinous crime and is prosecuted for it, and that ends up increasing uh, liberty, right, and decreasing the power of the state. So I'm not going to stand before anyone and tell them that jury nullification uniformly across the board in every circumstance is like a net win for liberty. Things are contextual and dependent. One of the things that FIJA has always emphasized is
Mm-hmm.
conscience, innocence, and specifically trying to. I mean, FIJA's whole perspective comes, I think, from Spooner, Lysander Spooner, and Spooner was focused on things that are vices, not crimes, and he was also focused on things that are or situations where laws are so incredibly unjust, or the conditions that one is in are so incredibly unjust that resistance becomes justified. Right? Spooner was one of the leading abolitionists of his time. He advocated violent resistance to slavery. I mean, you can really see the level of just like horror and moral like shock and the depths to which the atrocity of the antebellum South really weighed on Lysander Spooner. And it is the case that there were juries that refused to convict whites of lynching, but there were also far more in the overall evaluation of these things, juries that refused to convict people for resisting slave catchers. So if you evaluate things overall, this refusal to indict, or this refusal to convict, this refusal to, facilitate the state's repression, regardless of direction, ended up overall like siding for those fighting for liberty, right? And those in the Underground Railroad, or there were so many instances of entire communities that would like riot in reaction to slave catchers coming up in. And additionally, with the Fugitive Slave Act, they were trying to return people who had been born free, right? So it was literally, it was just racial profiling, right? Like the condition necessary to get someone to have to force the local cops, even those situations the local cops didn't want to do it, they would be imprisoned if they didn't obey the federal law on this, to force cops in the free states to round up, arrest, and deport to the South people of color, black people. That was that legal system was pretty powerful and overwhelming, but the resistance to it was facilitated immensely by jury nullification. And then specifically, like, if the cop tries to take them, the whole community riots, revolts, and impedes that. And then when they try to prosecute the community for rioting and impeding the slave catching, and again, catching people who in many cases were born free or had been liberated, but just needed the testimony of a single white person saying that they were actually the slave of this person. In those instances, jury nullification worked wonders, right? They'd try to convict the people who had rioted against the cops and fail to convict. And then they would try to convict the jury who had failed to convict and failed to convict. And like, it would just spin out and the entire community would be like, absolutely not. We're not letting you take
There
it.
is, yeah. I think Jesse Walker from Reason first posted this story, or maybe it was someone else, but basically the reverse of a horrifying drag the black suspect out of jail to lynch him situation. It was a mob rescued a black guy from jail to prevent him from being sent to the South. Like, it was... Yeah.
yeah. There were actually a number of those, and it was so widespread that they kept on passing laws and trying to do these things in order to prosecute the people who might assist the people assisting the people. That kind of like just the spread out, because insofar as the community as a whole was just found such policies so abhorrent and would not be party to them, they would like enforce the amnesty. They would functionally enforce amnesty laws of the free states, even though the federal government was opposed to those laws. Right. So
I think you kind of hit what people should know about being on a jury, but is there anything we didn't cover? Like, an FYI?
Yes. Obviously FIJA, go to, FIJA.org, and we have a variety of information and resources and the like that can point you in different directions and answer specific questions. But in particular, surviving jury selection is like probably the most important thing. And, the core advice that I would give is show up dressed as a bored, normie, middle American, right? Like, do not look like you are interested or excited to be there. That is an instant dismissal, right? You care too much. Like, you are not allowed to care. If you are a juror, that is super suspicious. They will throw you out, right? So don't look like you're excited to be there. Answer shortly. Do not lie, because lying can be like a violation that they can get you on, right? Like, but answer shortly, and answer if possible in like open-ended ways. If they ask you if you've heard about jury nullification, be like, I guess I don't really know a lot. I'm like not an expert, because you're not, right?
You are,
right?
So
and then be like, I'll just whatever the judge says, I'll do, right? Like that kind of thing, right? Just agree to the things. If they make you swear on certain stuff, just swear. Do not, and in general, it is. A lot of people will snitch you out on a jury unless you think the jury is like really close to tipping all the way. It's better to just get a hung jury than to get thrown from the jury because you're openly advocating jury nullification, and somebody on the jury is of a perspective that is like, this person is causing anarchy, we need to throw them out, right? Like if that's the trade-off is between getting thrown out of a jury and the jury continues and convicts, or you get to stay on the jury but you vote as one and you just declare innocent and innocent and innocent and innocent and you get a hung jury, like better to hang the jury. One, like, don't violate your conscience. They can't force you to violate your conscience. And then two, like, it may hurt the prosecution going forward. Like, they may choose not to bring the case again. And if everybody keeps doing that kind of thing and they just get hung juries at everything, well, all the better, right?
The book is called Did the Science Wars Take Place? The Political and Ethical Stakes of Radical Realism. Can you explain what the Science Wars was, perhaps, first?
Yeah, so it was a conflict that played out in academia most prominently in the 80s and 90s, basically over whether science has any traction on making models that are in any way accurate of the physical or material world. And it was also, and this is oftentimes lost or embedded in weird ways and weird tellings of it, a struggle within the left and within the radical left over postmodernism. And postmodernism is defined in all kinds of different weird ways. People go in all sorts of infamously in weird directions with it. And this also infamously leads a lot of leftists to be like, it doesn't mean anything. You can't use that word to critique us. Like, because people use it so sloppily that no one should be allowed to use it for anything. But the same thing could be said of like neoliberalism, right? Like neoliberalism is misused in critique all the time. People will be like, oh, you care about individual rights. Well, that's neoliberalism. And you're like, what? Okay, come on, buddy. Or like, like just describing some random capitalist thing and be like, well, that's neoliberalism. And they're like, that was the case in the 1800s too. I don't know what to tell you. Like, so I think that there is such a thing as postmodernism because there was a self-identified postmodernist movement. And we can look at that, and that's distinct from the post-structuralist current or movement in France in the 1970s and going back technically, I guess, in the 1960s. And in particular, the way that I kind of draw the bounds within my book when I give an overview, because my book is both history and philosophy. And so it weaves together like the political history and then formal political philosophy and epistemic philosophy in response and kind of ties it together. So there was a movement, postmodernist movement, and I ground it mostly, I tell the story mostly, and people, as with any social movement, you could slice things slightly differently or tell a narrative slightly differently, but at least there's meat to my story, which is that postmodernism was basically a milieu in New York City, and one gathered and mostly formed and mostly became self-identified, and most of what it ended up being influential as around the publishing house Semiotext. And there were other publishing houses that were very small, or like zines that were in circulation that were very small in the 70s. But from 1976 until the 80s, and Semiotext is still ongoing, there was this publishing house Semiotext, and originally it was a journal. And it was embedded in the subcultural and radical political scenes as well as in academia. And at that intersection of crossover is where postmodernism started to congeal as a orientation or philosophy, and kind of a meta-narrative unto itself. And that was a jumble of a lot of different things and sometimes self-contradictory. But one component that was in the mix, oftentimes quite prominently, was an anti-realist philosophical position. And sometimes a relativist philosophical position. Anti-realism and relativism are not quite the same thing. But those two things conjoined with currents in academia that were quite critical of science at the time, and had certain political orientations, and they kind of became a common united front. And then these increasingly, well, from the very beginning, had a lot of pushback from other radicals, had a lot of pushback from the left. So, for example, this would break, Jordan Peterson's brain, but anti-fascists were always, for the most part, like very vehemently at the opposite side of the radical political spectrum from postmodernism. And indeed, you had prominent postmodernists and relativists in this camp who were like screaming bloody murder about like Antifa folks in France jumping a prominent neo-Nazi, right? So you had all kinds of like conflicts and tensions and stuff, but you also had like anarchists and feminists critiquing postmodernism from 1976, like getting up and shouting critiques at Foucault and Deleuze and folks in conference in New York City, and being and they were so offended at being confronted and critiqued by the rabble, by not other academics, but by like activists and like and just generic punks, that they like stormed out and refused to come back. Right. So you have this history of tensions, and then also semiotext was in conflict within the anarchist scene, and Hakim Bey, Peter Lamborn Wilson, was also in intense conflicts in this sense. And so all those kind of conflicts were playing out with a ton of anarchists writing extensive like denunciations of the anti-realist currents. And also those anti-realist currents within postmodernism were intersecting with like post-colonial thought and with certain feminist currents, just as other feminist currents were critiquing them. So there's all this kind of like mix and fight. And this was very intensely like raging in the 80s. But it only really like bubbled up into the public perception in the mid 1990s when, there was first this book written by a pair of reactionaries who were kind of pretending to be like centrist liberals.
That'll happen.
And yeah, right. It's pretty standard. So they're like, oh yeah, we're just regular liberals. We just believe in the bell curve and like racial IQ and like, that kind of thing. So they wrote this book. It caught the attention of this young physicist who had been volunteering with the Sandinistas. So he had strong leftist bona fides, right? And Alan Sokal submitted an article to the leftist or to the Marxist zine semiotext. And this was it was a pastiche and attack upon one of the editors in semiotext, Stanley Aronowitz. Aronowitz had written a book, Science as Power, critiquing science basically as a power system and trying to take the kind of Marcusean currents of the Frankfurt School and make it more aggressively anti-science and anti objective reality in a lot of ways, right? No, that book is terrible. I abhor Stanley's book, and it's also just like filled with like misrepresentations of his philosophy, and like it's very haughty and cocky about what it says, but it's just completely wrong, or wrong significantly along the way. So Alan Sokal got a lot of leverage out of basically like going through and making a lot of mockery of the book by just providing a lot of citations, like as Stanley Aronowitz says, absurd statement, right? And the front of the piece, the opening like of the piece, is that there is no such thing as material reality. Everything, physics is at base just a social and linguistic construct. So this gets published, and everything goes hog wild, right? Like once it comes out that it's obviously like a hoax and he's like poking fun at them, and it turns into this massive blow up, and the humanities cluster together and say we're under attack by these barbarian conservatives who are trying to like defund us. And it's kind of true to some degree, because there were a lot of conservatives who saw this as a great tool in a broader war on left-wing academia that they were already embedded within. So it spiraled out, was on like the front pages of major newspapers, became this like huge thing, right? For like a long period of time, got huge coverage in the NY Times, etc. And became this like very showy thing. And it's still referenced to this day by all these different realms of politics, right? And in particular, it's funny because Jordan Peterson is basically a postmodernist.
I was just hearing maybe it was a YouTube person say like he won't shut up about how much he hates postmodernism, and he's incredibly postmodernist. And my understanding, which is much more limited, that made sense to me because of his whole, like, a dragon is literally real. Like, a story is as real as anything else, sort of.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some nuance that I would maybe give horribly in defense of somebody that I absolutely hate, which is Jordan Peterson. But he certainly, like, pulls from all of the realms of academia that I find noxious around postmodernism. And he doesn't have issue with most of postmodernism's like arguments. What he has issues with is like the basic leftist egalitarianism, like the values he has issues with. And when he tries to like ascribe things to them, like there is a sense in which postmodernism emerged from Marxism, right? Like, and a lot of leftists scream about how like they're two opposite things. So you can't say postmodern and neo-Marxism, but it's, yes, it's true that conventional Marxism, which, Sokal really represents, right? And now Sokal's a bit of a reactionary and like a full transphobe and like does a lot of like really nasty things. And the back half of my book is taking the core values of scientific realism and tearing apart everything that he has said, having built up that philosophical vernacular. over the course of the book, and showing how the currents that are now claiming the mantle of the science warriors and the science wars are themselves complete violations of anything like scientific realism. But Alan Sokal kind of represented the traditional Marxist current in conflict with postmodernism. But it is nonetheless the case that there were people within the postmodern currents, and Stanley Aronowitz is a pretty good example of someone who was, he on and off, his identification with postmodernism was a little bit weaker, but he definitely like wanted to pull very heavily from the prestige that they gave him. And he definitely wanted to like legitimize himself by latching onto them very hard. And so Stanley like tried to use postmodernism to prop up Marxism, and that was a certain current of Marxism that was definitely like his political project in a certain way, even though there were Marxists who were opposed to that. So it's complicated, and of course there are incredibly right-wing postmodernists. The Gang of Four in Yale, for example, who were some of the first early academic people. I don't focus on them very heavily in my book, but they were conservative, right? And indeed, Paul de Man, I think was his name, was literally like a propagandist for the Nazis. And and it came out at the end of his career, basically, that this giant of postmodernism at Yale was actually just a Nazi propagandist, right? And had been for, he was, but, like you read the content, you're like, wow, buddy, that's so, like there's always been a conservative bent. And of course, like other things that my book goes into is the ways in which postmodernism has dramatically influenced conservative and fascist currents.
I'd be interested.
Right? Those being distinct things, right? But there's whole chapters going in both about how there were always right-wing currents within postmodernism and or incredibly reactionary currents within postmodernism, and also how so many core things about the modern conservative movement, and then separately, insofar as we can still make that distinction, in fascist movements, there were postmodern influences, like very strong postmodernists, and very explicit. Things like creationism, intelligent design, climate denial. The people who did a lot of the heavy work on this, like very explicitly cited early postmodernists, and were very like enthusiastic about like, these people gave us the tools, right? And then also there were postmodernists that were like, yay, we gave them the tools. That's amazing. Thanks for doing that. Right. So there's this interplay there. But at the same time, there are people who are pulling from we're the defenders of a real macho, true, masculine, like objective science. And those people have oftentimes just defended wackadoodle batshit. I mean, some of those people are like complete and total, like anti-science cranks, or are, like the Weinstein brothers, like pushing fake physics, just absurd conspiratorial shit. And of course, like, a very lengthy chapter in my book, chapter 11 has 12 chapters, not including the intro and conclusion. Chapter 11 is just basically me going in at great length and drilling into transphobic narratives and talking about like how it's just impossible scientifically for you to be a scientific realist in a radical sense of the term, in any sense of the term that is like where physics makes sense as a science, right? And say that like biological sex is like a concrete thing, or scientific, like not anything other than at best a degenerating scientific research program, because it does not grasp at the actual roots of reality, right? It is something we have papered over vast, complex, underlying dynamics, right? It is a simplification that has a certain utility to people in some contexts, but that's always context dependent and always perspectival. Unlike physics, biology oftentimes is dependent upon perspective. We draw a line and just define a giraffe a certain way, in a way that is clearly not something that an alien species coming to this planet from a different perspective or a different vantage point would draw, right? Like they're not going to draw it the same way. So it's not actually objective. They will still have something like our structures of electromagnetism, Maxwell's equations, electroweak, etc. They will still have some of those structures. That is objective. But what a giraffe is, that's much more like subjective. And in the complexities around things that we consider sex, biological sex, quote unquote, those things are so deeply contingent and so deeply dependent upon non-scientific, non-radical, non-physics inclined perspectives in epistemology, like teleology, like something has an intended purpose, which is just not how nature functions, right? That like you just can't be a staunch scientific realist and defend such a thing as like sex free from social construction and the arbitrary like construction, the arbitrary associations of like human intentionality.
They sure tried,
human,
though.
like orientation. Yeah, I mean, well, what's fascinating is that most of the people who try to make a who try to glom onto the pretenses of philosophical
Mm-hmm.
substance, and then argue that that there is such a thing as biological sex, and in particular a biological sex
Mm-hmm.
binary, which you can say some things about bimodal distributions, and distributions in the plural across a variety of different features and dynamics and stuff. But that they try to say that there's a binary, strict binary with no exceptions.
Yeah.
That's just
And the
unsustainable. And
exceptions,
those people know
yeah.
that it's unsustainable, and they will make statements where they acknowledge that they know that it's unsustainable. They will make statements amidst all of their well, this is just scientific fact, this is objective reality, blah blah blah. They will make statements where they recognize that the rules that they are applying for what counts as science in this case would never be considered valid in other domains of science that were more fundamental, like math or physics or chemistry even, right? They would never make those kinds of distinctions. They would never recognize them. And they also understand that even within biology, there are far more rigorous structures that would tear apart the things and they understand further. They will even admit, Alan Sokal admits, that the term parent is socially constructed, right? If you have a
Mm-hmm.
foster child, you are that person's parent. Does that have a biological reality of what a parent is? No, we use the word in a more general sense because the words serve us, right? We are embedded in a practical. Anyway, so I could go off for a long time about how these people have vastly misappropriated and misused scientific realism and the notions of objectivity. And that's my book.
Right.
In part is to tease out the history, to be it is valid to criticize the left on certain things, and loose and pro woo and all this stuff, and have skepticism to absurd degrees. It is valid to critique the left on that. But you have to actually be concrete about what you're critiquing. Because some postmodernists that doesn't apply to. Kathleen Stock says that Judith Butler's critique of sex/gender means that there's no such thing as atoms. That's absurd. It simply doesn't follow. It simply does not follow, and it is absurd of Kathleen Stock, who is a hack and a complete failure of a philosopher. I don't say that lightly. I tear apart her work at great length because it is so bad, right? It is so just does not stand up to any rigor in philosophy whatsoever, so trivially.
Been listening to Who's Afraid of Gender, and we didn't get to the part where atoms don't exist. So maybe that's at the end,
Yeah, it's coming up. They're going to sneak it in just at the last moment and hit it. Yeah. So so it is important, I think, to always be critical. And this I pull from anti-fascist researchers and the who have this notion of three-way fight, which I think is very instinctive to individualists, which is that just because someone's out of power, just because someone's not currently running the government, doesn't mean that they shouldn't be criticized, right? They're a danger too,
sure.
right? And when the fascists are out of power, we should still critique them. We should still investigate them. We should still expose the things that they're doing because they're still a danger.
All too pertinent.
And
now and forever.
Right. And so the fascists are currently in power, or, but that doesn't mean that we should stop critiquing, I think, the left. I do think that's a very valid thing. We should always continue critiquing, the left and people among us, etc. We should always have those criticisms, but you have to do them in a right way. You have to, actually be sincere and engage with the actual literature, which, I have hundreds of books on my bookshelves right now that were all, for the research for the book. And it is important to go through and actually address those things in fair ways, which none of the people who are currently posturing as defenders of scientific reality and objectivity or whatever, none of those people are actually sincere or good faith, and none of them have done the reading. So
is there something reactionary friendly in sort of, I was going to say pop science, and I don't know if that's really the terminology, but I don't know. I just as a random non-science person, I find it easy to mock, a deeply religious, organized religious person who's transphobic, who says they only care about the facts and stuff. But the veil of science, I imagine, is much more effective around certain people, because you have to.
Yeah, there's still this background, I think, which I don't really know anyone that still subscribes to this kind of thing, but I know that these channels still do a lot of numbers. But the fuck yeah science kind of dynamic thing, where people will just kind of consume passively this science says we're going to have colonies on Mars and blah, blah. I'm like, well, that's not even science. That's like engineering anyway, which is a very strong distinction to make at great length in my book. But there's old hostilities between theoretical physicists and engineers. Anyway, but and so that's and that also bears out in terms of political valences. So there's actually a ton of research, really fascinating, that is cross-cultural or applies across a variety of different nations and the like, where engineers are one of the most reactionary.
That's right. I have heard that.
Fields overwhelmingly. Yeah. And some humanities are not that great. Like I think classics department, there's like a couple others aren't that great, but it's engineers are like so far extreme. It's like doctors and engineers, and then like theoretical physics goes like far to the radical left, right? Or like not as far as some fields, like obviously probably women's and gender studies is going to be further along, but like, or you know, whatever, what have you, Black liberation studies or something. But like, but physics has always been like a left-wing field, and that's a lot less the case today than it was back in the day. Like it used to be the case that there's all these quotes in my book from like people in like the 1940s who were like, basically all physicists are communists or anarchists and we need to kill them all. Right? Like kind of thing. Like, you know, like
didn't know that.
So the valences of politics and intra-academic disciplines have kind of shifted over the years, and there's a very specific history which I cover to some extent in my book. But in particular, the engineers versus physicists thing plays out in terms of pragmatism. So physicists are oriented towards a radical, that is to say, getting towards the roots orientation on things. If you say that your model has exceptions, the physicist goes, what the fuck? Let's drill into those exceptions because that destroys the whole thing. If the engineer hears that there are exceptions, the engineer says, well, are those within tolerable limits? Okay. Like, can we keep the bridge up if we ignore those, right? And so when the engineer hears that, like, whatever fraction of a percent of people like are intersects in a certain way that don't fit whatever thing, they go, well, that doesn't matter. That's a rounding error. We can ignore it. When the physicist hears that, they think, well, yeah, but how much of the universe is not hydrogen or helium? Yeah. Almost none of it. Are you going to say that that's a rounding error? Fuck you, right? So like the distinctions there are, and I've seen this play out in academic or science settings quite a bit, where so frequently there'll be people at a table at some academic conference or whatever, and politics will start like setting people off, and the physicists will be like, well, obviously there's no such thing as nations. How could you possibly like cleave that apart? And the engineer will be like, well, we can though. We can just use guns and cleave that apart. And so, you know, like the tensions there, I think, emerge from a radical or a reactionary, which in this sense, I'm using a very technical philosophical sense of reactionary sense of the term. But this is something that I really want to like expose, is that I do think that ideally physics is a very radical framework, is a very radical orientation and perspective on the world. And it historically had more in common with like radical left, you know, or liberatory social movements than it did with, you know, the right. And it still does to some extent, although that's been greatly diminished. And we should never cluster things together as STEM. Science, technology, engineering, mathematics, right? Like technology and engineering, very different from science and mathematics, right? Like almost completely different orientations or perspectives. They're intertwined. You have to do both. And I'm not saying that pragmatism is necessarily always wrong, but you know, like you need a bridge to work and you can't be a perfectionist about it. But like when that bridge is made of human bodies and that bridge is a nation state, maybe you should care, right? And maybe the exceptions do matter, right?
I mean, that is what there's. I was actually going to ask exactly this because I've seen. Okay, so if 1.5% people are intersex, these certain scientists in mind, they love to stress a much smaller number where they had particularly ambiguous chromosomes, genitals, etc. Because that's the only that's the most exception they can find that was made by science. But the argument is, well, it's statistically insignificant. And that's kind of all they have, right? I mean...
Yeah, and it's really like arbitrary. It's such an arbitrary notion of statistically insignificant. And it also depends upon, again, I hate to harp on this, but it depends upon a notion that those people are exceptions because they're not conforming to a way that things should be, which is a teleological notion, which the science wars were about critiquing, or Ronowitz trying to stick teleology in. Like he was trying to say that biology defends teleology, therefore it defends Marxism. because he knew that physics was like a danger. The reductionism and the radicalism of physics was a danger to the Marxist project and to Marxism being considered a science. So he wanted to say that, well, actually, fuck physics. Marxism is like legitimate because teleology. And so he wanted to support all this kind of like woo and nonsense in terms of like framings that like sometimes you pragmatically like temporarily deal with in biology. You say like, well, the organism is trying to do this or whatever, but that's not actually how the atoms in the actual like universe. That's not how evolution works. Evolution is not intentional. Like, you know, it's all just those are patterns that we pull out of the underlying mechanisms of, you know, selection, pressures, what have you, and so the notion of something there being an intended ordering to things, so that when somebody says, well, this person doesn't have gametes in these specific ways, but they should, right? Like their things should, so they're broken in the specific way. Well, broken is not a physics notion. That's an engineering or technological notion. So you're treating people as machines that are intended to have a certain purpose, which you have arbitrarily assigned them to some extent. I mean, like, it's not baked into the universe that we should reproduce, right? That's not like, the reactionaries always like to be like, biology is telling us it's this magical moral scripture given to us that says like, this is what you should do. And that's of course not the case. And if we care at all about the mind at all, we recognize that the mind violates like biological destiny inherently. That's why fascism is inherently anti-thought. But yeah, like in that framework, it's so radically anti-science to say that, or like radicals, you know, like it's so against the kind of reductionist radical perspective of physics and like core sciences, or things that I would call core sciences, to say that there is like an intended ordering of like genomes or chromosomes. So for example, there's this SOX9, I think, gene on a chromosome that if it gets flipped, or if it like gets interfered with, it interferes with a structure, or like that, basically how the entirety of sexual expression happens. So regardless, somebody can have they can have chromosomes, they can have XY chromosomes, they can have whatever, but like the flipping of this gene alone changes everything. So if you say that like men and women is XY, you know, XY and XX, and then ignore that there's other chromosomal situations, or say that those are, you still have to be like, well, that's not even causally like a good explanation of how things function, because like if this other gene just gets flipped for whatever reason, or like doesn't trigger or does trigger, like that is another like causal thing. And then you start exploring like the genes involved and the structures of the things, and it just like branches out 1,000 ways, right? Like not 1,000 ways, like trillions of ways. Like if we were to try to make like, you know, I say this in the book, but if we were to try to make biological sex, and whichever way you want to cut it, because often biological sex is oftentimes like, you'll say like gonadal sex or chromosomal sex or like hormonal sex, because you have to start like doing all this like more fine graining of these like things we lump together otherwise. And you want to say that like these things are like that makes sense as a scientific like bucket, you know, then you increasingly have to do all this kind of like shoveling things under the rug in a way that like, if we did that in physics, if we found those exceptions in the periodic table, right? Like there are exceptions and things like there's, you know, isotopes, whatever in the periodic table, but they're like the dimensionality of the exceptions is so fucking constrained. Whereas like the dimensionality of the exceptions and the underlying space of like genetic like dynamics and expression dynamics. And then like, you know, it's not just the genes in isolation, it's also like environmental conditions. It's just all these different, like the causality gets so fucking complex that if that were to happen in chemistry, we would just blow up the periodic table. We'd say this is no longer useful as a tool anymore, really. Like this, not as a core scientific thing. Maybe some people in some contexts will use this as a shorthand, but like we as scientists can in good faith use it. And so the engineering perspective of the good enough, and with the asterisk that just like silences anything that is an exception via the violence of the state, inevitably, is just so completely at odds with the scientific perspective that it infuriates me every single time that they claim science as their mantle when they're describing nothing like actual science.
And the people I was thinking of, at least almost all of them, are not engineers by trade, but they still have that mentality.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that there's, you know, I think it's more of a betrayal with Alan Sokal that he went off in the direction of like this, I mean, unsustainable arguments that are just so silly. I feel like because he did come from a background of physics, but oftentimes when you can parse these people apart, you find out that there's like there's always the tension between instrumentalist versus theoretician. The theoreticians tend to be more radical than the instrumentalist, who tend to be more engineering oriented just naturally. You can understand that. And again, I'm not saying that there's not a role for engineering perspectives and pragmatic perspectives in certain contexts, but like when you're talking about like what core scientific objective fact is, they don't get a say, right? Like on whether or not, you know, they found it useful in a context. And I also want to be clear that just because I'm saying that, like, and I'm focusing at this from like a scientific perspective of how biological sex breaks down as a like research program, does not mean that I am not saying that there are not cultural and other dynamics that are not important, right? Like, it is precisely because biological sex breaks down as a research program that we have to revisit why we came into the program in the first place with a notion of sex and a notion of like, and ultimately gender. And that's why I agree with Judith Butler that you can't actually distinguish sex from gender, and the two are like intertwined. They are not quite the same thing, but they're also not like separable ultimately. Like, sex is in many ways a research program or a perspective that we have because we come at it from like a pre-constructed gender program. Right? Like, gender is embedded within a society. And yeah, those things are also related to like material conditions around like reproduction, around like experiences of like, you know, there is bimodal distributions around like body size or whatever. Those things are very imperfect, right? And a lot of societies had gender constructions or sex constructions in different directions before like the very brief window of biology where the sex binary made sense. Right. And so I want to be very clear that just because I'm coming at it from the scientific perspective and like tearing apart the absurdly bad science and the insulting and infuriatingly bad philosophy that these people are pushing around philosophy of science, doesn't mean that I'm saying that like the only reason that we have to like accept trans people or whatever is because like gene like dynamics are complex or like multifaceted and multidimensional in this like vast array of things. It's also that, and you know, gametes, chromosomes, whatever you want to define. Of course, gametes are these vastly like aggregate systems that can come in intermediary. Anyway, like the reason why, and the only way that they're able to avoid the intermediary is to say that like, well, these things are broken. Again, they have to depend upon theology. But sorry, I could make so many asides and asides and asides critiquing components of things. But it is important for me to say that, like, just because I'm coming at it from that direction and hitting the scientific realism component, it had been very clear throughout the book, and I hope I want to be very clear in every interview that, like, I am also saying that as a consequence, like, because sex is something that we construct, because sex gender is like this constructed dynamic, and like, it, one, has to serve human interests, and two, like, it is vastly more complicated than anything that we could peg into the domain of biology, quote unquote, right? Like, it is something that is vastly more enmeshed in human practice, in human lives, and in the moral considerations that we have on those things. So, like, when I'm doing the undertaking and the labor to point out the bad science and the false scientific claims, I'm not like making a complete theory of sex gender, because I also think that would be so complicated that it would be beyond the scope of this.
Yeah, that's an important clarification, that it's like, it's not like, well, because we have to accept intersex people, then I guess we'll accept trans people too. That I also don't want that to be misconstrue me as saying that. I have noticed though, like, for example, in the federal website purging of the T, you know, literally on things like travel warnings to different countries, it used to say BTI, and now it says LGB. So, like, I have seen the I for intersex also removed in the haste to disappear the existence of trans people. So, unfortunately, I think they are getting lumped in the eagerness to fucking oppress trans people. Might as well get them too. But, you know.
Yeah, there's a quote that I pepper my book both with quotes from official philosophical texts and formal academic things, and also just like sources that I think are relevant but that are funny in the context of an academic piece. And one of them is I quote a neo-Nazi commenter on a neo-Nazi blog, or technically a neo-reactionary / neo-Nazi blog. And this is from years ago. And the commentator says something along the lines of, for the rule to live, the exceptions must be killed. And is talking specifically about suppressing the rights of women. And you know, I think to me that's like such a salient, like such a perfect example of the reactionary perspective, that they come in with pre-given perspectives. They have a pre-given notion of sex. They have a pre-given notion of whatever. And insofar as exceptions might cause some friction or some pushback, or force them to take a more radical analysis and look deeper at things, look at the actual roots of dynamics, reevaluate, absolutely not. Yeah. They refuse to. They would rather just like line up the guns and shoot everyone who is an exception, right? And that to me is like such a perfect encapsulation of just the like, well, we want to throw intersex people into the wolves and like refuse to acknowledge that they exist to such a degree that we deny them like medical service, right? And of course, in the process, like trans folks. And I don't want to be using intersex people just to defend trans people, et cetera. I think we can make the distinction, but it is, of course, important that in attacking trans people, these people attack the science of intersex people. And it is important also that in defending intersex people, the consequences of understanding that like it's not sustainable to like keep a biological sex binary or whatever as a scientific theory, like that's not sustainable in any like deep sense. That also has implications for like, well, then what are we doing with these terms and these concepts? And that I think opens up space for trans liberation.
Oh, well, I hope listeners are also much more intrigued by the idea of your book now, just from hearing that. That is a good teaser for it, I would say. I was going to do the lightning round. I did kind of want to ask you if you feel any satisfaction in being far more correct than not about the threat of actual fascism, because I've been following you for years and years, and I would say that you called the current moment more than most, and I wasn't quite on board with you because it seemed so pessimistic, and surely we all watched World War II documentaries as children and therefore at least weren't going to be Nazis. Did you call this? Is it any consolation to have called this? And do you feel like you called this, I guess?
I mean, yeah, of course I'm right about everything, but I think it was there were moments of consolation back in the day where I wanted to do I told you so little dances. And no one really paid attention to my I told you so little dances. And I was like, but the proof is already here. And now I'm just like fatigued and like ready to just fucking, well, when's my bullet arriving with my name on it? Like, you got to do what you got to do in the meantime. That's kind of more like my attitude. So.
And I know this will go up a little late. God knows what will happen in a month from now. But, well, oh my gosh. Do you have enough battery? Are you plugged in for your
I've got 20% left, which I think is enough to last.
Hey, wow, the lightning round has there's a true tension now, technological okay. Well, literally the first thing was supposed to be optimism or pessimism, but Star Wars or Star Trek?
Star Wars, obviously. Star Wars is anti-fascist in a very strong and visceral sense. It's also proletarian, like, sorry to get class dimensions on this, or lumpen proletarian, sorry, even more class. And lumpen proletarian / petty bourgeois, even, and in terms of its politics, it has a class awareness and a grittiness that I think is far more relevant. Don't get me wrong, I love Star Trek, and I'm like currently watching through Voyager again on like a rerun or something, just with skipping a bunch of episodes. So there's many things, but of course Voyager or Star Trek is like social democrat and authoritarian and hierarchical and the like. And Star Wars has those components, but it's about true. Resistance, which at least makes it more optimistic.
That's true. As much as I've been watching all the Star Treks in existence lately, and Star Wars though was like foundational child thing, and I was like, hey, it's still good at least.
Well, and Andor is just one, like Andor and Rogue One, like one of the best sequences of anything ever. I mean, in terms of things that I was right about, let this also be a broadcast to Jason Lee Bias that he is wrong about Rogue One, and I have never been proven more correct. But anyway.
Fair enough. First stop in your time machine. you're just for like a viewing, maybe not. No, you're not changing anything. Maybe just. I mean, we could.
Mm-hmm. Sure. What
Yes.
am I viewing?
Where like you have a free ride in a time machine. Where would you want to go? Or when, rather?
Just to visit.
Yeah.
Just to visit. Okay. Well, okay. I mean, like, probably really, really early if I could get away, if there's like you're not affecting, there's nothing that's going to, if we just have like a camera, honestly, so you're not infecting anything. You're just magically viewing into the past. Probably really, really early. There's a social revolution that happened by all accounts archaeologically, 7,000 BC, something like that. In Greater Turkey, Anatolia, in not Kutulhayuk, in Kanayu. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. Where for like 1,000-mile region or radius region, an entire society basically like changed overnight, and the houses of the rich and the rulers were burned down, and houses were rebuilt, and people had like more egalitarian distributions of wealth, and there was a 1,000-year period with no recordable archaeological instances of death by violence, or of human caused death by violence. So it's like 1,000 years of anarchist peace. Whatever that was. What, I don't know the society. I don't know what happened. I don't know what other negative, terrible things they did. However horrific it was, whatever the trade-off was, the kid in Almulas that they tortured to make their society work. I don't know, but I would love, if I have a camera and I can see things, it wouldn't just be like having a conversation with people that I really admire, like Voltaire or Enrico Malatesta. It would be, I would really, really, really love to see the spots in history, the empty gaps between the empires. What flourished when the boot wasn't crushing human face?
That's a great answer.
Like for those windows.
It's the most anarchist answer. I guess. Well, okay. Who's the most overrated anarchist thinker? Just to get
overrated. Well, that term also requires me to say that somebody's an anarchist or concede that they're an anarchist. And there's people that I don't want to concede that they're an anarchist, right? Like, I would not want to concede that Hans Hermann Hoppe is an anarchist despite his identification. I would not, and he is highly rated, right, among certain,
yes, you're right,
fasci, like ANCAPs. And I would also not want to concede that that Noam Chomsky is an anarchist. Absolutely no way, never, not giving him that. There's positive things I could say about some things that Noam did, right? Like, I give him some wins in some categories, but I definitely think he doesn't go up to an anarchist. And there's other individuals that I would exclude from anarchism for like their own words, right? Where they clearly cross certain lines where you're like, well, come on, like nobody. But overrated. Oh dear.
I mean, I will take those answers as well because they're certainly called anarchists.
Yeah, those are safer answers, I think, than me particularly. And I would also have to pick fights with like specific tendencies and be like, well, everyone like pulled too aggressively from Kropotkin, and I love Kropotkin, but they've like really misrepresented. I'd have to do something weird, and I don't want to do that. So let's go with the easy answers.
Okay. See, now I just want to go on more tangents, but like, who's your favorite minarchist?
Oh, good question. That's a good question. That's a really good question. I don't have like a lot. There's a bunch of libertarians that I really respect and admire. Some less so after certain choices that they've made. But I guess Don Lavallee, I don't think was formally an anarchist. If he was a minarchist, then I would count him. I'd say that's a pretty safe left market anarchist answer. I'd also say that there are some philosophers who would identify as like Marxists, but like more on the libertarian anarchist friendly side of that spectrum that I have a certain affinity for. And one of them even, Pete Wolfendale, was a philosopher who collaborated on editing and providing aggressive early feedback on my book, and Nate too. And there's other people that I don't necessarily know would identify as xenofeminists, et cetera, who I don't know who would identify as anarchists, and whose orientation may not fall within the right libertarian notion of minarchist, but who are very, very intensely concerned with the state, with state power and limiting it, even if they come at it from a direction that would be like pro-welfare, if not necessarily pro-police state, right? Like, when you say there's going to be a little government, that really leaves open the question of where is that little government going, right? And people will draw that in very different directions. But there are some more libertarian inclined Marxists that I find a lot of value in.
Yeah, there's a handful of ones that are still dependable, I think, too, which is nice.
And, Deirdre McCluskey, like there's other people that I find value in. She has said some things that I really don't like and has fallen short of some moments, right? Like, so it's hard.
She's incredibly compelling in person as a speaker, and the only thing I've read of hers in full is her book Crossing, about her. I don't know if she still calls it a gender crossing, but that is such a fascinating book, and I wish I could assign it to various cis people.
Sorry, you know who I will actually grant the label of anarchist to, but who I think is almost entirely overrated and almost knows almost nothing. And I actually dog on him for like a page in my book. Michael Harris.
Okay.
I will grant to him that he is an anarchist, despite him being an ANCAP and a complete reactionary fool. I will actually grant to him. I will give it to him. This is charity case. I will give it to him. But I think his philosophy is like really shoddy and lazy, and I think it leads him in all sorts of bad directions. And he usually gets most things wrong because he argues from a common sense perspective rather than a radical perspective.
There might be like 2 ANCAPs left that are kind of okay, but I don't know anymore. I haven't checked in a while. Best concert you ever attended?
No, not Metric. I'd actually say Churches. Yeah. I'm a big electropop person, so that's yeah.
Favorite tree or plant? That's it.
That's open-ended. I'm sure I probably have a better answer if I thought about it for a minute, but probably a Doug fir, because to be a horrible like Portland nationalist,
like a Douglas fir, but like on a more personal,
a Douglas fir, like
a closer relationship.
Well, so there's this horrible like bioregionalist secessionist movement that I do not endorse for Cascadia, and their symbol is the Doug fir. So it's like on a ton of things here. Like it's also just like on like the flags and stuff that move from this movement are like present on like soccer team and sports stuff here. And so it's just like ubiquitous as like a local insignia. So it's probably a very bad insignia to pick because it's so localist.
I mean, better, and I have not spent much time in the Pacific Northwest, but I don't know if someone kind of like you has ever written about, I mean, like the 2 groups I associate with the Pacific Northwest are like Nazis and anarchists, kind of.
Yeah.
Talk about the duality of man. So like, that's a book, I think, for somebody to explore that.
Well, there have been books that have been written on that. So there's, if you want it from like a more conventional establishment liberal perspective, there's 100 Little Hitlers by Eleanor Langer, I think. Is her last name, and she writes about how Portland used to just have the streets entirely like overrun by neo-Nazi gangs, and how they would like control the streets just openly, flying, swastikas, etc., and would beat people and like would attack people and interrogate them to demand to see their ID to see whether or not they had a Jewish last name, would like jump immigrants, and and those people were beaten off the streets and driven back by both anti-fascist researchers and anti-fascist like street fighters, and cleared them out of Portland and out of Minneapolis and some other places where they had dug in so deeply in the 80s. So that is definitely a situation where you have like the 2 extremes like defining the city, right? Historically, like the deep East Side white pride. I mean, that was Tom Metzger's game, but there's like so many others, and there's still like, I mean, like outer Southeast Portland is basically just a checkerboard of different neo-Nazi gangs. Some of them are just like dealing meth and not really bothering with anything, and some of them are actually like murdering people for sport, and occasionally like, oh yeah, you in order to get into your gang you had to murder this black person grotesquely, or oh, you took a belt sander and sanded off all the skin of this person and dumped their body on like this intersection of my house. Cool. So that's like a dynamic that's always been present, but there's always been strong resistance I think maybe as a consequence of people who just, and also it's a very white region, so props to the people who were white but who looked around at like the neo-Nazis their own age and their own coterie and were like, never, I'm not doing that, never, not once, and fought back, right? So
all right, well, primitivism or transhumanism?
Well, transhumanism, obviously. But like, people always think that I'm like fetishizing like a technological like I will get this new tech toy or whatever. I think that people should have options. myself, probably in a forest in a cabin with a ton of books, right? Maybe some things on the edge, but like people should have options. And transhumanism is about expanding people's options to have the tools and to utilize them and have extra years of their life or whatever, right? So it's about options for me.
This was Chris's excellent addition. Your favorite fictional AI/robot?
Favorite fictional AI? Okay. I'm going to forget. Okay, no, I'll give an easy answer because it'll allow me to plug an anarchist book series. So Ian Banks wrote the Culture series, which is basically the anarchist version of Star Trek, or anarchist critique of Star Trek, where like the Federation is an anarchist society rather than like a social democrat authoritarian society. And so it's a society kind of mixed of robots and various species and genders and people constantly changing their bodies and their minds and stuff. And it also has like bigger ships that are themselves sentient in AI. And there's the entire society is dependent upon like, a shared culture, as it were, and the ways in which culture in a decentralized way enforces norms and rules. But there's one ship or AI in that culture that violates the rules of that society quite aggressively and is like an outcast and sanctioned and, despised and spat on by all the other members of the society, or almost all the other members. Sometimes people are secretly working with this outcast. And that outcast's name, as given to them by everyone else and not their name themselves, is Meat Fucker. And as a derogatory name. And the thing that this mind does that gets them such hostility from everyone else, and I don't agree with this. I don't actually think they're right to do this, but I do appreciate the character. Is they go to places. So there's something like a non-interference system in the society, or something where the interference must be there but much more limited. Like they're trying to build societies towards these non-technological societies towards something more like an enlightened anarchism. And so they like don't fiddle with certain things. Like they're not going to overthrow dictators too early because that would like deprive the people of the ability to build their own resistance, etc. But when a dictator like an genocideer dies, Meat Fucker zooms in and beams the person out just before their death, and then replaces them with an identical body, and then takes that body, keeps it alive, and tortures it for eternity. Because Meat Fucker says, like, there is actually no hell, and there is nobody who will actually punish you for the billions of people that you have murdered. I will.
So Meat Fucker...
And I don't agree ethically with that choice, but I love that character.
Meat Fucker has read Harlan Ellison, and he's taken inspiration. I don't know. I have not read Ian Banks, and my friend has been recommending the one you met. Actually, that time we met, has been telling me to read him for years, and I haven't gotten to him yet. But now, that is more. Mm-hmm.
It's one of my favorite books. I cried more when Ian Banks died than I cried when my father died, and my father's death was pretty powerful too, but like Ian Banks is somebody whose thoughts and perspective and like the feel that you get of another person when you read all of their literature, and he wrote so many books, is like very deeply resonant, and I deeply cherish the person that he was.
All right, well then I'll check him out sometime. I need some sci-fi. I'm running low in my sci-fi inspiration. Well, I guess if you have people like 3 anarchists, dead or alive, to have at your dinner table, that can be our last before the cappuccino question.
Who?
I always make it 3 for some reason.
Well, there's people that I would want to interrogate and ask them specific questions of, right? And be like, and this, or people that, who died horrifically, and you would want to give them the last, like honor of like last words, or like more that could be like what are your last requests? What are the things that you didn't get to say? And that's probably where ethically I'd be forced to go for the people that died most nobly.
That's fair.
But if I just wanted to chill and nothing would like
have the best
consequentially
dinner ever,
come out of it,
like,
probably,
just,
it'd probably be Enrico Malatesta, Voltaire and Declare, and why am I spacing on it? Goldwater speechwriter.
Carl Hess. Mm-hmm.
Carl Hess, yes, Carl Hess. Because Carl Hess had such a trajectory,
my God,
and also had a bunch of takes that I'm not saying that he were the best, but that is someone who had conscience and came from the deep right and like came around to something very close to like a plumb line anarchism in a ton of ways. And I have a lot of admiration for Carl Hess and would love to talk with him just as a person.
That'd be a good dinner. I'm inviting myself to that dinner as well. And how would I get a cappuccino in your imagined political utopia?
I feel like you've asked me this
Not
question
me.
before.
It would have been
but
it would have been Joel, not me.
Okay, that's true. That's true. Joel asked me this question. Wow, that's so many years ago now. Yeah, I mean, let's see if I get it the same way that I got it back then. I don't know what I said, but I'd say pretty much every way that you could get it, right? Like, I want a society that is robustly diverse in terms of economic system, that you can get it by going up to a coffee. I'm not going to prescribe to anyone. Like, whatever will be under freedom, modulo our continued activism and pressures off of our values, etc. Because it's not just a sit back and like, oh, there's no coercion, whatever comes is therefore good. But like, you're never going to put like a gun to do social engineering on a certain way, right? Like, there's limits to like what you can do. Like, you can sanction someone for like being aggressively racist and you can all choose to boycott that person's bar, but like, there's limits to what you can do in terms of shaping things. So like, if you get that coffee by going to a Food Not Bombs hippie squat punk like whatever thing on a land project, sure. If you get that by going to like a literal cafe shop on the corner that's like run as a business, even like a small business where there's like a boss necessarily, like I could see it as a situation where there's like where that's a minor component of the society, right? Where there's like voluntary situations where like, like my partner worked at a cafe for a long time and there were a couple hippie old radicals that like ran it and owned it and took the risk and the other things that came with that, and then worked really, really hard to provide stability and safety for their employees, and like were deeply caring people. And it's not in vogue to say that there can be such a good thing as a boss, but I want to be clear that exceptions are possible, and if you can get away with it in a society by not being so horrific that like the rest of us organize against you, right? Like, fine, sure. So like anything in between, somebody like there's a replicator that makes you your piping hot cup of coffee because we're highly tech. Anything is possible here. And of course, it may also be the case. I want to be clear on this, and this is maybe my primitive slings that come to the fore. Maybe it is the case that it is not possible for us to get coffee, right? Maybe it is the case that like the ways in which people are growing coffee right now are so shaped by state coercion, power, and domination, and like, so many different ways along the entire production chain around the living conditions, the people doing it, that coffee, if we were to pay accurate prices for it, prices that were not warped by the state's violence, it would be so high that it would not be feasible for there to be coffee shops in places like Portland or whatever. That may be the case. And if that is the case, then we should bite that bullet. Right? Like, it is more important that people be free. So I don't know.
That was the gamut of everything. But also, yeah, I've actually almost anticipated that answer to come up more often than it does. And you phrased it in the most reasonable and slightly guilt-tripping manner. But I would prefer the replicator coffee if we can do it. There's always the hope. Okay. Well, where can the good listeners find you on the internet?
Yeah, so I write and have written for 2 decades now, or something like 2 decades and 22 years now, at Human Iterations, which is now at humaniterations.net. That's a personal site. And then at C4SS, I publish a lot of things, so c4ss.org. I'm currently doing and helping get Fiji back on its feed, as we talked about in terms of jury nullification. So Fiji.org, we could really use a lot of support and help if folks want to get involved or they want to give donations there. It's really desperate in this sort of situation to get that information out and to help people. And then lastly, my book, Did the Science Wars Take Place? The Political and Ethical Stakes of Radical Realism, is out via C4SS Press. So you can get it at the store.c4ss.org, or you can go on Amazon. C4SS only delivers within the United States because of just shipping charges. Whereas if you want to get it print on demand delivered elsewhere in the world, you can get it via Amazon at your local version of Amazon. That's Did the Science Wars Take Place?
All right. Well, maybe I'll just do that. And maybe I'll go to C4SS because I unfortunately live in America.
Well, you can also get it from Amazon too if you want it faster. We'll be a little slower about shipping.
I'm sure that's true.
Like, to be fair.
Well, as usual, people can find me on Blue Sky all too often. That's mostly where I am, but Mastodon as well. It's like, what podcast am I doing right now? Non-Serviam is still on Blue Sky, Mastodon, Instagram. I think Twitter was finally abandoned, thankfully. So yeah, follow us there too if you want to, because Chris is a good person on the social medias. I'll let you go so your computer doesn't die. I ran out of blood sugar, but this was a lot of fun, and I thank you very much for coming on today.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
All right. You're listening to the Non-Serviam Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, why not subscribe over on our YouTube channel or on your favorite podcast platform. You can also follow us across social media on Facebook, Instagram, and Mastodon. If you're extra interested in seeing this project continue, consider becoming a patron over at patreon.com. But if you can't contribute financially, we still like you a whole lot. You can help us out just by liking and sharing this episode or any other one that catches your fancy. As always, shout out to our existing patrons. Your support helps us reach a larger audience and helps keep this project alive. Thanks so much.